I'd like to apologize for the delay in this project. We were making some momentum in the fall, moving ahead. We kind of got busy over the holidays, and then we had a busy start to the year in the planning department. We've also had some key staff members leave. So with that being said, we are trying to get back on track. Appreciate all of you sticking with this project and continuing your support for us moving ahead on this. We sent out the 80% draft for the committee's review back in the fall. We also opened it up, put it on our website, and received comments from outside groups. Many of them are here tonight. I just want to remind the groups that this is a discussion for the committee this evening. If outside parties still want to share comments, emails, we will get them to the committee and share them with them at a future date, but this is a committee discussion. From that, we received over 190 comments in. I'd say plus a lot of different things for the document, sharing grammatical errors, different things, updating spelling, different things like that. We included those. Not looking to discuss those this evening. Of the 190 comments, and I'm not trying to say that any comment is not important, the committee got all of them. They got all 190 comments. They got all comments that were received to date. You had those. Just tried to boil down this evening, and that's the handout we had that you came in, ones that we thought needed further debate. We got a lot of comments in saying we'd like this or we need further information from the consultant. We agreed, everybody that had comments agreed, so we didn't think that those needed further debate on those items. Some people said we need to pay attention to the environmental aspects of some of the certain areas. Again, it seems like the committee all agreed, or we need additional information on that. Again, the committee all agreed on those, so not saying that the comments that are not listed tonight are not important, or the committee hasn't received those. All comments were in. The comments that we have listed tonight were just ones that we thought needed further discussion, debate from this group, that we can kind of come up with, hopefully, a consensus, whether, one, we need more information, need further discussion. So that's kind of, we boiled them down. So as you kind of see at the paper in front of you, we kind of start first with general comments to the document in general. Committee member comments on the first page, first and second. Then you go to committee member comments on Manitou Lake specifically on page 3. Then non-committee member comments on the overall document, and then non-committee members on Manitou Lake specifically is kind of how it's set up. So similar to what you've seen before, and then the comment numbers listed on the side is the comments we had them, if you want to relate back. We had comments 1 through, I think, 190. So obviously there are some omissions in there that we've left out, so 1 through 6 is not included in this document tonight, but you have those previously. It does have the reference to where it was in the document, what the comment was, and then what the agreements were, and then we had some of the basic feedback in there. So I'll kind of cue those up and kind of start talking through them. Have open discussion. Zach's got a mic to run around if we want to have comments, discussions on that, whether we need further information. Hopefully we have time. I also kind of want to talk about permitted uses. Section 4 of the document has listed permitted uses for mixed use as a whole. We haven't really kind of boiled down to, do those make sense for Manitou Lake being this group here. Later we'll talk about 250 and anything that should be added or deleted out of those as well. If we don't get to that discussion due to time constraints, we can bring it up at a future meeting discussion, or please provide feedback as well through email or letter or something else. Afterwards we can continue those discussions. So item number 1, we can jump in right now. Talks about discussion of transit stations. We should have more focal in the mixed use about transit-related items. May not be as relevant for Manitou Lake in the comment, but also is relevant to 250. But again, these are general comments in this first section to the document as a whole. We need to relate and remember that originally we received this grant through a GTC grant funding based on transit-oriented development. So we need to come back and make sure we are talking about minimizing car use, how we relate into having other transit oriented development, RGRTA, if there's accessibility for that. So I don't know if there's thoughts, discussions on ways we could, should interrelate, additional transit uses. I know we've talked a lot about, there was comments about incorporating the bike plan into it. I think that'll definitely be a referencing the bike plan. We've talked about, pedestrian bike connections. I know there was some comment in the Manitou Lake one about the question, the possibility of using golf carts, thank you, either within the facility. There was talk about, connection with golf carts to Panorama Tops area. I don't know how that would relate. That would be more of a, a DOT question, or something that would have to be, obviously, you could have registered and licensed to be on the road, but any initial thoughts, comments on comment number 1?
Well, Mark, just real quick, as far as GTC goes, I mean, our portion was really oriented towards Route 250, and that's where we're looking for a lot of the transit. So I know you mentioned that, but that's all right. Yes. So as far as the Manitou Lake site goes, I mean, obviously, if there's a role for, more transit-oriented development, that's great, but I'm not sure, realistically, on that site, I'm not sure how much of that you're going to be able to get, so.
I know the Manitou Lake site is a little bit more confined. I don't know about, obviously we'll open it up to our GRTA at that point. Talk to them as whether they would consider it. Obviously it would be dependent on what the development is there, but more probably getting access towards Panorama Tops area. How do you have interconnection, sidewalk connections that could get somebody to a, more of a main hub location?
There's a park and ride there right now, right? At Tops?
I believe so, yes. So I think getting connections to that park and ride would probably be a bigger discussion item, or get that, main connection linked to that.
Right, I think taking advantage, as opposed to creating something new, taking advantage of what's already in place should be emphasized, right?
Yeah.
As far as sustainability, capitalizing on what's already there and being spent.
Anything else?
The document is intended for the document's intended for future mixed use, not just these 2 projects.
Yeah, and
so
we constantly have to kind of remind ourselves as well about that, as we talked about, buildings from the 1940s, and we can talk about that further. We said there's really not that many aspects of buildings in the 1940s, either Manitou Lake or 250, but as you look towards the 4 corners, those more historical buildings, would come more into play. So that's kind of this overall section would deal with all 4 districts, and then would be specific to each individual area.
I would check the agree column and get it into the purpose, and then the language being something with, where appropriate, and then you look at Manitou Lake and say, well, that isn't appropriate maybe for a new thing, or you can rely on existing, but with try to keep it as broad as possible, knowing something else could cross our path.
Yeah, obviously 4 corners and LaSalle's Landing, may have many more opportunities for, bus-oriented type, access into or out of. Okay. Any other comments on number 1? Okay.
I guess the only other thing I would suggest or add in there is that, I mean, just the nature of consolidating all of these uses in one area is going to lead to fewer trips on the road, and that is going back to the whole GTC piece of it. If I don't have to actually hop in my car to go to a coffee shop and I can just walk there, that's 2 trips gone, right? So.
Yeah. Great point. Okay, item number 2 talks about incorporating active transportation, bikeability, bicycle infrastructure, ADA compliance thoroughly and consistently throughout the document. I think actually that probably was one of them we could have extracted from this comment or this discussion here. I think those things were universally agreed by the committee is walkability, bikeability, ADA compliance is kind of a universal throughout all the districts. If anybody has anything they want to comment on that, we'll take it. But I think that's one, as the other comments, as we had agreement upon or universal need, I didn't think that merited additional discussion from this group. Comment number 10, consider requiring an affordable housing component within each housing development. define the percentage of units and the percent of the mean annual income of the residents to be sought. Some of the feedback we got on this one, obviously we had some, questions on this comment. I think a lot of the feedback was we should look at this as a consideration, but possibly not a requirement. We are going to be asking a lot of the developers on the back end of, putting in bike paths, putting in walkways, doing a lot of improvements. So in some instances, it may be difficult to task them with doing low-income housing on one end, affordable housing, and then asking for additional amenities on the other. But obviously, if they can afford to do it or whatever the mix is, that would be a site plan issue. We wouldn't, prescribe that they had to have it, but, if it was an option or it came in through site plan, we would, take a look at it. Any thoughts, concerns? Anybody want to have a mandate to affordable housing percentages, or that is a requirement?
Seems very restricting to developers coming in. I think it's, the challenge is to develop the area as is, to make the most out of the area. So could we put into the document it's for consideration for the developers, so that they at least consider? Maybe it does fit into one or both of the areas or future areas, like you just said. But I don't agree with mandating it. But.
That kind of seemed to be the consensus, and again, in our feedback, we tried to summarize the feedback we did get from the group, that they didn't feel a mandate was required, but just want to make sure the group is in agreement with that before we move on. Okay. Number 12, the document refers a lot to metal halide or cold-corrected sodium light sources, said that LED should be considered. And then with that, I think that brought up other things, talking about other sustainable type features, whether we want to incorporate or at least suggest, solar panels or other. I guess we can leave it as just sustainable things, as this document grows and moves on. I'm sure there's new technologies we don't even know are considered today. But I think supporting LED or any sort of, sustainable features, I don't think we would exclude, people want to do solar panels. I don't know what the group's thoughts are on, wind sources, geothermal, or leave that up to a future board for site plan concerns rather than, legislating that through an ordinance. Just kind of leave it open-ended. You can make a suggestion towards, sustainable type features, but leave it open for a future board to review the individual items.
The only thing with the lighting, I know the valley below the light now from the tops, I would say, and I'm not a big fan of saying they need to be dark sky compliant, but they should be dark sky designed.
And we, at least through the planning board, throughout the town, we kind of regulate that now. I don't know as we have a specific ordinance, but we do say dark sky compliant lighting. The planning board has stressed LED lighting in the applications we've had so far. They haven't required it anywhere. But as the costs come down, they've suggested it, and we've seen more and more applicants come through and actually have decided to implement that.
It's a nice light. The LED is really nice, what I've seen of it.
Okay, seems like we're all in agreement on that one. Comment number 13, the guidelines recommend avoiding duplication retail services and services offered in the four corners. And reading through this, and I think most of the comments back was, I think it's going to be hard not to duplicate some of them. That's kind of what we're targeting is, at least in Manitou Lake and I think in all the areas, is smaller services, not big box services, smaller coffee shops, dry cleaners, office buildings, stuff like that. So, I think we can change some language to say, try not to detract from those areas if there's unique features in, four corners or other existing commercial districts. But I think it's going to be hard to say that you can't have duplication of retail services. I don't know, what you would have left or, what would we potentially drawing from.
Yeah, I agree. The boards have typically not weighed in on economic considerations like that, right? In the past, it's a lot.
That's
Pretty darn easy.
moving on.
It's a different market area as well. Economics is going to dictate what you do.
I mean, that's kind of where the planning board, town board is today. I mean, they've always operated under, like an economics drive, like survival of the fittest, not dictating that you can or can't have this or that use there. I mean, as long as it meets the permitted uses, within that area, let the market drive, whether you have a Kentucky Fried Chicken next to a Wendy's next to a Burger King, obviously, their own market studies tell them whether that makes sense or not, or a Wegmans next to a Tops or Lowe's and Home Depot. Obviously, they have their people to figure that out. Okay. Item number 14, the ordinance requires a minimum number of uses and the different zones based on acreages. Would low-rise housing and townhouses, for example, be two different uses? I thought that was a good question. I think that's a question up for debate amongst this group is, what do we feel that two different uses is? Two different types of residential, or do we need to be one residential, one commercial? Again, do you let the market drive that? I don't know. Yeah, I mean that's the other thing with the ordinance. We're trying to keep it as flexible as possible, so it can be developed as needed, but also define it enough that this committee and the town ultimately gets what they would like to see in a nice quality development.
So the only problem with that, though, is that in some of those zones, there's only two uses required, right? So I could come in with single-family homes and townhomes and say, hey, I'm meeting the intent of the code. I have myself a nice residential development and not do anything that's really mixed use, right?
And that's that's I think always going to be an issue with some of the smaller lots. I think Manitou Lake is kind of a bigger piece, whether that's developed as one developer or not. 250 has got a lot of smaller residential lots that if and when they sell, 1 acre, 2 acre. I think that's where you run into those issues. Is what is two different uses? How do you get mixed use out of those smaller lots?
Mark, is the question is that putting two residential uses? The question is that a mixed use? Is that really what the question is?
I think that's where we're coming back to. Is how do you?
I don't see that as a mixed use.
We require two different uses. We say, okay, if you're don't have the sizes, but I think we say less than 2 acres, it's minimum of two uses. 2 to 5 acres is 3 uses. 5 acres and above is 4 uses or more. What do we define as different uses? I mean, residential is, 2 different types of single-family residential or townhouse residential.
Yeah, I see residential as a single use.
Then I think that's the question. Is as we're debating as this committee is residential. I mean, okay, do you say single family is one type of use and multi-family is another use, or just residential is one use, and so you need two different types of uses?
If everybody subscribed to that thought process, you'd have all residential development with no services to support anybody out there.
I think you're setting yourself up for this basically being almost like an incentive zoning without the incentives, right? I mean, if residential's in demand, you're not going to get any of those other uses.
The other thing I see there is I don't see single-family detached homes being built. There's just not enough room. So you're gonna have apartments, condos, or townhouses. I think.
If you delineate residential, then you're going to have to delineate retail. Okay.
That's it.
I mean,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, that's kind of where we are.
If you say residential is townhouses, if you subcategorize residential, then you're going to have to subcategorize retail.
I think if you look at Manitou, for instance, because we're all here for Manitou, obviously it's going to be primarily residential in nature of some type. But there has to be some component that allows for commercial activity that's geared to that area specifically. I mean, nobody's going to make the drive down there to go to the drugstore when you've got Panorama across the street, but You do have the pond, and if you have the pond, you might have maybe a kayak shop that might want to work out of there, or a bike shop, or even scuba lessons or something like that. You have to have some kind of small uses in there to kind of offset, or provide a service to the people that are living there. I think you have to mix it up. I don't think you can just have all residential, different types of residential. That's more of a multi-use district than it is a mixed-use district.
Don't you think the market's going to dictate that?
Oh, it always does. And maybe the market today isn't the market that is going to drive the process 3 years from now or 5 years from now. I think if you gear it to the value of the pond, people will come there for the pond. You've got to have uses that people will come there for and spend money at that point for the pond.
Okay, so is the consensus residential is one use, so 2 uses needs to be residential, commercial, residential, retail, residential, service, something, okay?
Yes.
Agreed.
I take consensus by the heads nodding and the affirmative action. Comment 15, might reconsider not permitting manufactured homes. They're improving in quality and becoming more mainstream. I think we got feedback about pre-engineered homes, and I think the distinction between manufactured homes is being on wheels versus pre-manufactured homes. I know a lot of the Ryan home developments, we consider those pre-manufactured, where they're manufactured somewhere else and then put together out in the field. What's the thoughts on?
Well, they're bringing hotels together on wheels now too. I mean, it's a new technology. It's a new way things are getting built. I don't know how you. I mean, I think you have an architectural review process that deals with it. That's my thought. I'm done. We're close this time.
All right. One person at a time. Start throwing at people.
Anybody else have a thought on a manufactured home type use, or leave that up to a future board's site plan review?
Pretty much up to the planning board and where they want.
And that's just capturing the thoughts of this committee is what, I mean, that's the fun.
Was the intent to identify a manufactured home as something like a mobile home? Is that in your opinion what's occurring?
Was to prevent that. is what-
Because there are specific districts that you have to be in the town of Penfield to conduct that kind of operation. Now, if you want to go in and build a manufactured home that has been pre-built somewhere else and bring it on a foundation, that you can do.
Okay, that's what I thought they were trying to do.
Yeah.
They were trying to rule out.
But, but if you're ruling out, having a mobile home park on that location,
Okay with that.
that's not zoned, that's not what we're going to zone that for.
Yeah, you have 2 manufactured homes on the road.
Yeah, we have them all around.
Yeah.
But the idea of creating another mobile home park, that's not going to happen.
What about RV parks?
We don't have a zone for that in town yet.
Is that a permitted?
It's not a permitted use.
RV park. Currently, we don't have an RV park district in the town of Penfield.
I think they did that.
Well, some people could come north in the winter.
Oh,
in the summer.
absolutely. We would have to create a new zoning district to accommodate that. We don't have it on the books right now. We have
And
it.
it wouldn't be permitted in Manitou.
No.
Okay. Seems like we have consensus on that one. Next page, item number 20. Make sure uses are sensitive to adjacent land uses, which I thought, I think we kind of referenced, but then there was the comment that this seems to conflict with the tall structures allowed in Zone A. So specifically in Manitou Lake, we are talking up to 6 stories, so I kind of just thought that opened up that discussion as whether this group is still in agreement of up to 6 stories within the Zone A district, is whether that seems reasonable or not, or whether there's still issues, concerns with that.
In that sentence is adjacent, existing adjacent outside the district, or is that adjacent within the district?
I took it existing adjacent outside the district.
So did I.
And I think, in the document, and I think we've talked about that before, is, Manitou Lake, I think, is a little different, but 250, talking about it, adjacent to the road edge, I don't think anybody in the committee is looking for 4 stories, as we were talking there, as being right up against either 250 or Atlantic Avenue. That would be a stark contrast. I think if you have a lower level building near the road, or as you move back into the site, we could say something similar here, that maybe a 6-story building directly adjacent to the water's edge may not be appropriate, but a lower level building close to the water's edge, and then as you move back towards the hillside, a 6-story building up against the steepness of the hill may make more sense.
Mark, even in terms of a single 6-story building, we talked about the importance of the architecture being compatible with the area, maybe stepping it back, using colors that are...
Yeah, I think we have a couple of comments after this, is some regulations on stepping it back. As you go up, and either have a patio, so you just, again, don't have a vertical, see more of a city-esque building that kind of is a straight, flat facade, but having it step back. I don't know which page it will coming up. We'd have some comments saying it should be a 25% decrease each level. I don't know if we want to be that detailed or restrictive, but just say, a stepped approach as you go up, levels that kind of, marries it in, or, matches the site a little bit more.
And I think as you move towards other properties, you have to scale it back down to kind of blend in with what's happening on other properties. I know the gun club is concerned, they don't want a 6-story building next to them, and I don't blame them for that. As you get closer to the east, maybe scale it back down to a 2-story building or something of that nature.
Okay, so it sounds like the group is still supportive of 6 stories, but with caveats of tapering to, 1, the water, 2, the neighboring properties, in kind of stepping it, and not having a straight up vertical 6-story building.
And I can't remember, 6 stories, we also have a height associated with that?
I believe we did. I think it was a maximum of 75 feet.
Okay.
And I think we were going to talk about that on 250 as well, as what maximum, you can say 4 stories, but obviously,
Right.
There was comments about a 14-foot first floor level. We'll talk about that comment again, but obviously, we can put a maximum height limit on that as well. Okay. Comment 22, promoting a human pedestrian-oriented scale. Does this ratio concept contradict the Manitou building height? And I think that comes back to the comments about 1, stepping the building, but I think there's a lot of, and I'm not an architect, architectural features you can do at a street level with canopies, with different things, so it's pedestrian scale when you're on that level, not just a flat facade or a straight up elevation to that. But that's kind of what I took from that comment was, how do 6 stories relate to, human pedestrian-oriented scale? But I know, there's a lot of features you can do at street level that, kind of keeps it, outdoor patio areas or canopies or things that can have a pedestrian scale at street level, even though and then step the building back, as you move up. Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think a lot of this is going to be boiled down to what type of architecture and application you're getting and where they're trying to congregate those uses or structures or...
Yeah, okay. Comment number 23 talked about car charging stations, but it also said if we're trying to get away from automobiles, do we consider de-emphasizing the automobile by taking that away? I don't think we're, in the climate we're in the area we're in, we're ever going to eliminate automobiles, and we're trying to get away from them and try to minimize their use. But at least my thoughts and some of the comments we got back was, as we talked about earlier, sustainability. We are moving towards electric cars, so at least having facilities for them. I don't know as that encourages automobiles. It just reflects that, we're going to have them, and we're not leaving the automobile, but even if you can park it and charge your car in, we ought to at least consider sustainability and at least recommend that, to any developer that's coming in that, they consider those.
We're doing that on large scale in commercial development now.
We are
Encouraging it or requiring it? Encouraging?
We're encouraging.
strongly encouraging.
Strongly encouraging.
Yeah.
We've installed, as the town, we've installed 2 car charging stations ourselves already. There's one out the back here, there's one at the community center. I believe we're considering one more, I don't know which location, so. Harris Island, thank you. We've put up solar panels. Shout out for, I believe it's May 21st. We've done solar panels on, this is a little sidebar, but solar panels on Harris Island Park building. We've done them for a pump station. On May 21st, the town board is going to be considering whether we want to put a solar farm on the highway garage facility property. So if anybody wants to come out and comment on that, they're looking at doing an agreement. It's like a third-party power purchase agreement that the town wouldn't incur any cost to it, but we would agree to buy back the power from whomever installs the stuff on the highway department site at a reduced rate over a certain period of time. So a little sidebar, a little shout out, but the town has kind of consistently tried to be sustainable and try to show that, if we can do it, then hopefully developers can do it. We've installed rain gardens and some other sustainable features, so we've tried to be progressive in that aspect.
Is there a sustainability section? I forgot to double check that. I think
Not,
it's more just woven in.
yeah, it's kind of woven in. So I think that's one thing that we need to, emphasize more in the document is talking about sustainability and some of those features, and encourage that as part of the development. Comment number 25 talked about removing some of the bulleted items about reducing parking requirements, reduced fees in select areas, and reduced amount of parking. Some of the feedback in at least my comment is, possibly the reduced fees we may not entertain over what we charge, but through shared parking agreements, we, as the town, standardly do allow people to have shared parking, which reduces their parking ratios that are required if you do have shared parking, and then amount of parking. But in talking with Jim earlier today, I think there's areas we may consider having areas of land bank parking. So if it's as successful as we want it to be, or Manitou Lake, is all that it can be, or there's events there or something like that, there is areas that, hopefully we set aside areas that, could grow, with land bank that, not to encourage over parking it, but, if there's the demand for it, maybe there's areas set aside for it that, could potentially be, built in the future.
Well, there are projects that fail because of insufficient parking.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that's going to be a balance between, we don't want to see fields and fields of parking for, any one of these uses. That's the point, is to kind of get away from cars, but
if you push that back to the applicant, it kind of pushes it back, the responsibility on them to demonstrate why they need 500 parking spaces or whatever it is, right? Versus requiring 500 when they only need 300.
And I say at least the planning board has been very open to that. Recently we're working on changing our parking standards on what we require, and hearing what the applicant says. They know their business, they know what they have. We may allocate that they have land bank parking, so at least it's accessible or available if and when needed, or the use changes that it's there, but not forcing them to put in 500 spaces when they only need 100 spaces for whatever their use is.
You have 1 or 2 events a year, let them park on green areas.
Grass, right.
Instead of asphalt.
But as a society, we're transitioning to less and less trips and less dependence on the car. But in 2014, we are a car-driven society, and it's not overnight are we going to fill hundreds of residential units with no places to park.
Comment number 26, shared parking for residential units. 300 feet seems too far away for parking that is used for residential. Need some thoughts that this should be a maximum distance, but it depends where, if you live in a more urban commercial area, I mean, you can walk a couple blocks from a parking space or an apartment complex or something else.
You're walking more than that in the Wegmans parking lot to get to the front door.
Any thoughts or concerns about 300 feet is a,
I think that should be left open. Yeah, open market, project.
I mean, we were kind of encouraging, at least they had stuff in close proximity, but obviously the developer is going to want to make it marketable to their, whoever they're, you know, obviously if you're looking for seniors or something like that, you want, you know, parking and ADA as close as possible. If you're doing some retail areas and people are walking to different areas, then, you know, 300 feet, you know, is not a big deal if you're going to a shopping center or accessing Wegmans or something else. Okay. So I think we can take out either say that's a reference or something like that, but I don't think that's a hard and fast number that it has to be, you know, 300 feet only.
So that could be a recommended, not a shall be.
Yeah. So I think now we get into the committee members' Manitou Lake comments specifically. Comment the idea of an 8-story Seneca Towers would be revolting. You know, I think we all kind of agree with that. I think this brings us back to our conversation about being a 6-story max, you know, with language to step the buildings, you know, have a pedestrian scale, different architecture. Okay. Number 59, and I think that kind of leads into our discussion about permitted uses. We talked about minimum of 2 different uses. We kind of talked about that they truly need to be different. But in that section, it does not list any permitted uses. In the sections 5 and 6, currently, they just refer back to section 4. So within Manitou Lake, and I don't know if we want to get into that conversation now or we want to hold that discussion to the end, is there specifically permitted or non-permitted uses within section 4 that you feel make sense or don't make sense in Manitou Lake? And I don't know if we want to hold that conversation at the end, keep going with the comments we have, but then have an individual discussion at the end about permitted uses, non-permitted uses. Want to talk about that now, or would you rather wait till we get to the end?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Jump into it?
What was the intended, because on that table here, that chart on page 91, it's just blank, right?
91 just refers back to section 4 and just says see permitted uses in section 4.
So
We gave you a hard copy here printout of what section 4 says today of what's permitted, what's not permitted. Is there anything specific in Manitou Lake that you would like to see or not to see that's on that list? Right now we've just said this is what's allowed in mixed use as a whole across all 4 districts. Now we need to start honing it down to what makes sense in Manitou Lake may not make sense on 250 or vice versa. No dry cleaners in Manitou Lake.
Anywhere.
or anywhere. You're talking in
I'm just talking about right now.
in mixed use as a whole. Or you're talking.
No, I mean, that's just too sensitive.
Just talking
It's just
about
too much underground stuff going on with it.
Later.
We're cleaning up a lot of,
That's
sites.
too. It's just an ongoing problem.
You did recommend hotel use, I think was one of them. Anything like spas or anything of that nature? They have a nice spa with the water. What kind
Or
of,
if there's
what kind of
uses that are-
schools are you anticipating? Like a public or private school, or a school in which you would go to learn how to dance, or?
I mean, I guess that's what we define. I mean, I think or in 250. I mean, in a lot of other mixed-use districts, you see civic uses. The town hall is part of the mixed-use area, or a community center, or that type of thing. So I think they kind of segue that into schools. But Manitou Lake, I don't see a school being down there.
Actually, I don't see a community center being down there, or even a church.
I mean, are those things you want to exclude, or again, let
It's not the
market
best use for the property.
drive, or what's
It's not
your?
the highest and best use
Yeah,
for the
but again,
property.
the economics is going to dictate.
Well, would you want to see a school down there? Then we should take it out.
Well, it's school, if you're thinking
I'm
of
thinking of a
young
public
children
school or a
coming to
private school.
school, that's different than the school of fine arts where
Right,
three
and
people
that's
take
what I'm
painting
saying.
classes.
I don't
That's
even
what made
want
it to be
school buses
fine
going
between-
down Old Penfield Road if you get out there.
Be a yoga school or
Well,
something,
school
you know,
buses,
How about a learning center?
learning centers.
school
That's a different-
district's
that's
not
a
gonna
different
build a
thing,
school
yeah.
down there.
Yeah. You're right, I mean, an art school or something of that nature, yeah, absolutely. Only imagine 50 school buses going back and forth every day.
What about churches?
I think there's court cases that say you can't
You can't prohibit it.
prohibit a church in any district.
Right, you can't. I wouldn't encourage it as a permitted use, though.
You would encourage it?
Not.
Currently, we don't list conditionally permitted uses, or, so what do you want it as a conditionally permitted use, or just,
They are now in our code.
yeah?
Nothing's permitted by right for a church, it has to come in as a conditional permitted use. But Bob's absolutely right, the Ripple law does not, Ripple law, or whatever it was, does not allow for churches to be excluded out of any zoning district.
But would you not comment on it and have it deferred?
You could make it a
to
conditionally
whatever
permitted use, I guess. I'm
Town
not quite
code?
sure how you want to handle it. Is there an intent to have conditionally permitted uses versus permitted by right?
Don't know. I mean, we do in most other districts in town. We have permitted, conditionally permitted, and not permitted in most of our districts within town. So if there's ones that, you know, conditionally permitted is use that has to go to a higher level of review, has to meet a higher standard to show that it, you know, it's not going to have, you know, impacts on the neighboring properties through, you know, additional traffic or light glare, or, you know, those things normally through site plan. But conditionally permitted is a higher level of concern to go through to make sure it meets those standards.
In the Four Corners, there are no permitted uses, they're all conditionally permitted based on parking issues. And as a result, everybody has to go to the town board for an approval. But the town board has also instituted a streamlining process where if it's a pull-out, plug-in type operation of the same type, they do allow it to go through without a public hearing process. Most of this would all go through a public hearing process because it's all new development anyway, so you wouldn't, most probably would not have to have you go through that a second time if there was the same kind of use coming in.
That's a consideration or discussion item as well. I mean, I know to point, the town board has let this committee, you know, kind of work on its own and says, you know, we'll ask for a recommendation from this group. I mean, ultimately, would this group like to see the planning board or the town board or what permitting group? I think ultimately the town board is going to come back and ask this group, you know, what's the recommendation from this group? So I may not need to answer tonight, but, you know, those are things we also need to look at or discuss is once we get done with this and we talk about process, and I think there's comments in here later on, to put it out there, the process they have in there today was basically put in as a placeholder. That is not our typical process that we go through in the town. So it's one thing we need as staff is to kind of go through and refine that. But ultimately, that's going to be a, you know, a recommendation from this committee as well as what is the process. I think the town board has asked, what's the committee's thoughts on rezoning of the property as a whole? You know, we talked about that, I think, at 250 last time, and I think, you know, and I won't speak for the group, but I think the 250 group kind of said, you know, if we're going to go through this and we're going to, you know, do this district, we ought to look at rezoning the district as a whole. Ultimately, we need to define a boundary, but there, you know, once it's done, it's defined, it's rezoned, so you're not have another level of, you know, red tape for a developer to come in and say, okay, now I want to apply to be mixed use. And I don't know, as we, at the last meeting, I think we talked about it for Manitou Lake, but I don't know if we came up with a conclusionary discussion. You know, would this group recommend rezoning this once we come up with a document that you're satisfied with to mixed use over Manitou Lake? I guess that's question number one.
Yeah, is there a reason, I mean, if we truly want this to be carried out the way we're all envisioning it here, why, it seems like the best way to do that would be like an overlay district with these boundaries attached to it as rough, I mean, guidelines on where the property is. Not that these boundaries necessarily are gonna line up with existing property lines, but I guess what I would hate to see happen is we have all of these, what are guidelines right now, and you have somebody come in and say, well, we're meeting the intent of the guidelines, and it's really just left up to whatever the current board thinks at that time, and it doesn't meet the intent of this.
Or we put this all in place and then somebody has to come in at another level, to come in and say, I'd like to apply to be rezoned to mixed use. At that time, now you're adding another level for a developer. I think if we're going through this process, going through setting up these standards, saying this is what we like, this is what we'd like to see, have a consideration to rezone it to that, have that area rezoned to some boundary. We'll have to define that area so it is a defined area, but have it rezoned to mixed use. And then at that point, they would come into some board, whether the town board wants to take that on or whether that gets deferred to the planning board. I guess that would be another recommendation from this group. What would your preference be if it's rezoned to a normal district? It could go to the planning board as it's, R120 or anything else, would just be a normal application. The planning board reviews it, handles their normal process. The town board currently has the Four Corners, LaSalle's Landing, and anything that was incentive zoning. Falls under, am I missing any? That falls under the town board's jurisdiction. So the town board handles those 3 items. The planning board handles everything else. So, again, we don't have to decide that tonight, but, I think items we need to discuss as we move forward, as we talk about process. How does this get implemented? Once it's in place, what's the process for somebody to, to meet these standards, and, who's the reviewing agency of it?
A while back, I thought, when we had talked about this early on, we were talking rezone. So we still haven't resolved whether that's the process we want to take or not. Is that correct?
I think ultimately the town board's going to look for a recommendation from this committee to say,
okay,
we recommend, here's the document we like at the end of the day, and we recommend it to be rezoned to that, should the town board consider it, and we'd like the planning board to be the group that takes it on. The town board could take it and say, thank you, but we want to keep our control. But all the feedback that I've gotten from the town board, they've stayed away from this process on purpose. They're not here. They don't come to the meetings because they want this committee to act on their own, not feel the influence of the town board. They want this to be a committee project. Again, that's why we're going through comment to comment. Staff is facilitating it, but again, it's this committee that's deciding it's 6 stories, deciding that it's this, deciding what it is. So ultimately, the town board is looking for this committee at the end of the day to say, this is the document we like, here's what we want to see, here's how we think it should play out, here's how we think the process is. The town board could take that, consider it, change it if they want to, but all the feedback I've gotten from the supervisor and the town board so far is let the committee do their process and have them provide recommendations to us and how they would like to see it and what they'd like to see at the end of the day.
My only concern is the planning board is not set up to say, okay, this is the setback, they're not set, that's, the process, and whether it be right or wrong, has always been to, if there's a variation in setbacks, it goes to the zoning board, back to the planning board. For the planning board all of a sudden to have to decide, how do you guys do a PUD? Is a PUD a rezone, a PUD?
Well, actually, you got to go through the planning board and the town board.
See, and I think that's probably the process. This is kind of what you've got here. I don't know. That's sort of where because the planning board's very good at certain things and not so good at other things. And I'm not saying Penfield's planning board. I'm just saying planning boards in general.
And I'm just opening it up as discussion item, and I say we don't need to resolve it tonight, but that is one of the items. As we get into this and talk about process, is ultimately going to be looking for from this group is to say, here's how we think it should go, or we think this is good. Obviously, staff can weigh into that and provide our process as a normal path forward how we handle applications. We can fill in some of those blanks and I say what's in the document. They put in there is.
I think we need to kind of get that key issue resolved sooner rather than later, because depending on what path you take is going to dictate how this language reads. Is it a guideline and it's open for interpretation, or it's an ordinance and you got to meet the ordinance? And so
and I think we're going to have some of both. I think some is going to be an ordinance of what's permitted, not permitted uses, as we do for any district. I think some of the manual part is a guideline of here's how and what we like and images we like and what we'd like to see. So I think ultimately it's going to end up being a mix of both.
I think that these sites have to be rezoned, or else the flavor of the projects is going to change with every administration.
Right.
And there's biases and fairness and it takes a significant effort to bring a major project forward asking for a rezoning compared to bringing a project forward that is consistent with the zoning. The risks are different. The ability to push that project is limited to a very few people if you have to do it all on spec.
What's the rest of the group's thoughts on, I guess, item number 1 is, once we get done with this in this document, is the group's thought on rezoning it to mixed use over that area? We can work on defining what that area is and where those hard boundaries are. I mean, that's kind of where we've been going, but I just want to make sure we have consensus on, on the group is, I mean, originally the town board had talked about doing it the other way, having it that we would come up with a mixed use ordinance or mixed use district, and then you would apply, say, okay, I'd like to be mixed use on my property, and here's how I can comply with that. But I think that takes it, as Bob said, that's a higher level of somebody that has to do a full-blown plans to show how they can be in compliance with mixed use, and then it's determined, no, you're not, or no, not in this area, or something else, where you're doing a lot on spec for, the wish and the hope that you be there, and then you get spots of it of here, okay, this one made mixed use, this one didn't, or I think kind of this, and I think the goal of this was to kind of have a universal design that kind of carried through a whole region or whole area, but
Yeah, that's what the town applied
for 250 and 250, the group, and I again, I don't want to speak for them, but I think we kind of talked about this at the 250 meeting last time, and the group, from what I heard, kind of said, let's do the whole thing. So 250, we got 250, I think, kind of settled down on that. So I'm just coming back to Manitou Lake, and I think Manitou last time, we didn't come to a consensus, or at least in my thought on that, but it seems like we've heard from...
Sorry, Mark. I guess if you don't rezone it, you could end up with a single-family house in there, or whatever it's zoned now, right? Because and that's what you're trying, I mean, that was one of the big avoidances I heard early on. So
That's kind of where staff is, but I just want to make sure this committee is of the same thoughts. And again, this is a committee-driven process, so I'm just trying to make sure that, the committee is in agreement with it.
If it turns out to be really successful, the town board could always rezone some additional property to make that parcel bigger, that zone bigger, as they see the pattern that it's developed in. But if every project comes in asking for rezoning, boy, you're going to have a tough time controlling what you get.
Well, I think in fairness to the boards, we should identify the areas that we would recommend to rezone. We can't hope that the board's going to, go this far when it should have gone that far, or not far enough, or too far.
But if you define using some rational method what the limits are, 20 years from now, if that's the center of activity in Penfield, they could change the zoning for additional properties.
Sure.
And I think we have gotten some comments that in this bubble that we've shown Ellison Park, we've shown town-owned lands that are restricted, so we've got some comments back as how are we rezoning some of these areas to mixed use when they're owned by the Monroe County. We kind of just put a bubble out there just so we wouldn't forget about Ellison Heights, Ellison Park, town-owned land, Genesee Conservation League, so I don't think all the areas within the bubble that we would look to rezone. Obviously, we're not rezoning county-owned land or town land that is currently restricted. So that wasn't the intent with the bubble that we've kind of shown. It's just that, as we're looking at that areas, we don't forget about those surrounding properties and, to exclude those, Thomas Cove Road or, other things in the area that we're not looking to potentially rezone those, but, we didn't want to ignore those. So the bubble does go over areas that are either not under the town's control to either rezone or are either restricted. We've bought development rights on other properties, so it's acknowledged that those properties, probably wouldn't be rezoned, but we are looking at them, and that's why the bubble, kind of does cover those areas already. But it seems like, am I seeing consensus that this group is saying, if we're all happy with this at the end of the day, that rezoning of that area to mixed use makes sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Comment number 60, I think this comes back to the comment we had last time. 115,000 square foot resort and a maximum 6 stories above ground. I think this came back to the discussion we had last time that we were talking, one, we didn't want big box, but we also had a limit in there in that chart. I don't know if it's page 93 or whatever you referred to, Dan.
91.
91 that limited it to 15,000 square foot maximum per area, but I think we've had some comments about, if it was a hotel that had a restaurant use that had, something else, not saying that's what we're going to get, but, just trying to think of, different uses. You may have bigger than a 15,000 square foot limit on it. And again, I think we talked to the 250 group, and I think we thought that was too conservative to limit that to 15,000 square feet. But then I think we need to shore up what our definition of a big box is. If we say we don't want a big box, we may need to, back up what that definition is, and, how do we exclude that?
Recommended maximum size?
We can.
Resident specific.
We can. I mean, we can have a suggested maximum size if there's a number you're thinking of, or
Maybe it's a percentage.
Like, go to the calculations here, when you have something in here that percentage of the area is supposed to be used for non-residential purposes. 25%. Well, if you build a, 200,000 square foot residential complex, that means you're going to have 50,000 square feet of retail. And that's or non-residential uses. That's a lot for there.
and we've heard comments to that as well. That 25% is a lot on that end. I think we were looking to have, or the consultants were recommending having some limits, or at least as we talk about two uses, part of this is to incorporate some commercial or some other non-residential use. But I think maybe we can back into that if we say that residential is one use, you have to have another use. Maybe we don't need a limit on, forcing somebody to say you have to have 25% commercial on your property if the economics don't make sense to have 25% commercial. Manitou Lake, I mean, it's going to be a destination location. You're not driving by, as Jim said, to go to, CVS or something else. It's not highly visible. It's not, a drive-by, hey, I'll stop there. It's going to be a destination, so maybe 25% is a high number to define you have to have it. But if we say that two uses, residential is one, you have to have another use, then, maybe
What
we...
about recreational? I mean, does that get lumped into that as well? Because, you throw that into that mix right there, all of a sudden, that's not so insurmountable, I wouldn't think.
And the consultants talked about the failure of mixed-use projects, and one of the common flaws of ones that didn't work well was that they didn't have enough other uses than residential. But we're not, I don't think we're seeking high-density residential with a laundromat to serve or high-density residential and a rental office as being the mix. I mean, some people go to work there.
Dan makes a good point, though. You build a residential and a recreational component into it. I mean, I could see, and the recreational component could be any one of a number of things. Maybe you're renting out paddle boats. Maybe you're, I don't know what you're doing, but you have some component there that is other than the residential. I could see that as being something to soften the need for that much more commercial. You're right. That's a lot of residential and commercial components.
Yeah.
If you get a lot of residential in there.
But I think if we incorporate recreational as non-residential, for Manitou Lake, that may work. I mean, if you have kayaking, canoeing, you have stuff on the water, fishing opportunities or other uses of it. Jim brought up a good point today, and I think we've talked about access to the water and access to the area around it. We've said that, you have to have access to, I think we're at like 80% of the lake has to be accessible either with a path or something around it. You can have 20% that's blocked off, but I don't think we've ever talked about, either docks or things that are out into the water. Do we want to permit those, not permit those? We've talked about requirements of having public access to the water, that the public can get there and, launch a boat or launch a kayak, but
I think you would certainly, I mean, that's your biggest asset, I think, is the water, so I think you'd absolutely want to allow that.
Docks create more shoreline.
just questions to make. We kind of brought that up today, is we've talked about access to the water, but we've really never talked about docks out into the water, or, what the group's thought is on that.
You're gonna have kayaks, you're gonna, canoes, you're gonna want at least a small dock out in there that makes it much easier to get in and out.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about non-motorized boats as well. What about consideration of like an electric boat or pontoon? I could see if we talked about scuba diving and the one area is 100 feet deep. If you had a pontoon boat that took you out there and then you went diving off of the pontoon boat, if the pontoon boat was electric, what's the thoughts, concerns?
I mean, it seems okay, I mean, just as you're talking about it, I mean, it seems okay to me as part of a business being operated down there. I don't think, you're going to want everybody in the town of Penfield showing up, nor are you going to get it with a electric boat to go goof around in the lake. I mean, but if you had a business that was
40 party boats, all tied together, floating around out in the middle of the lake.
We do that in Irondequoit Bay.
I don't think you're gonna have a launch site, though.
right. Well, that's what I mean. I mean, but if you had a boat or something that was part of a business, I mean
that's just one thing we thought
that was
about.
based down there. That
if you had scuba diving or something, or
you're not right. It's not going to be a public.
That's part of a business. They would need that for efficiency.
Seems a liability for all of this.
Adjacent homeowners.
Well, in the case of boating, you would be the business operator. It's just like
Right.
over in Quite Bay now, where they rent out
It's an
pontoon boats to
emergency
the public,
response
whatever the
kind of
case may be. They take on that
Or two.
liability, and that would have to be the case here as well.
One jet ski to go out and get the drowning
But
scuba
if there's a
divers.
public launching site, who takes on the liability for that?
Well, if it's a public launching site like at the north end of Quite Bay, the state takes on
With the
that
sheriff.
liability. It's a state launch.
But the state's not gonna take it on here.
No, this would be privately maintained and privately owned by some small operator. They'd have to have insurance to ensure that whoever's going scuba diving off their boat does it properly and they're properly trained. But they would take that liability.
Well, I understand.
So the town's not gonna take the
that part of it, but I don't understand the part about the public using it and who's gonna assume that liability.
Well, the sense the public would use it, we're looking right now at the idea of getting a pathway around the park, around the pond. The actual use of the pond itself would probably be driven by the market. If somebody wanted to open up a kayak shop there or a scuba diving shop, they would take on that liability as part of that process. You would pay for that that use. For us, we're looking for public access around that pond so that we've got access to the water's edge.
So you're saying around the pond,
Not-
Well, there could be points, we talked about that when we walked the site with Jack a couple of times, there could be points on the pond where you go out, and have a dock or something where you could go out and look. It would have to be, railed in so that you're not just sitting there, going over. But,
And obviously you got to talk about fishing as well,
Fishing.
and other things of,
yeah. and
if
in that
it's open
case-
to the public, do you have at least publicly designated areas, that, at least allows for fishing possibilities, or if Joe Public wanted to bring their kayak there, is that allowable as well?
In cases where, we have problems on sidewalks all the time, people fall on sidewalks, we assume that liability. If we take an easement over that path area and the docking that's associated with it, we would have to take the liability with that as well.
because people would want to go with their own kayak, put it in,
Right.
and go. They're not going to rent it, so they're going through a process.
Well, that could be a situation where the kayaking company that would be there would have a little launch area to do that, and you would pay them a couple dollars to launch and get out, The town of Penfield doesn't want to get into the kayak business, I don't believe.
But we want to prohibit the public from having a public launch area, as we do down at the bay right now.
Well, the public
What
launch
about
area will have to be
behind towers?
responsible for
Rented
it.
kayak or.
I mean, those are considered waters of the U.S. I mean, same as like Irondequoit Creek. This is a little different, as it's a
standalone.
private pond.
Man-made.
Yes, and that's the part if you launch into, through Ellison Park or behind Tops or something like that, you launch into the waters of the U.S.
That's
Same,
right.
same with the Irondequoit
Is
This
Bay.
will be a private pond. This is not going to be publicly owned. It's going to be owned by...
Well, I think that presents the problem then, because then you have a private company now taking on the liability for that, right?
Is the entire shoreline within a single tax account number?
No, there's a few tax codes.
And you can
They have to
access
be
it
subdivided.
via Irondequoit Creek?
I think you merged them together.
It's all combined. It
Yeah,
doesn't
I
show
think
that
they've
on
merged
our
them
maps,
together.
though. Did you do that recently?
Years ago.
Because our tax maps still show those as being broken out.
You guys paid to have that consolidated a couple of years
There's
ago
a-
into
so-
one parcel.
Thomas Cove and
Oh, they have that.
the water's edge are not touching.
I'm sorry?
No,
Thomas, the right-of-way
No.
for Thomas Cove does not run to the water's edge.
No.
There's a
No.
piece, strip of land in there.
no. It's currently encompassed entirely by this one parcel.
Can you kayak into the pond from Irondequoit Creek?
No.
We bypass the pond, but you can't go into
There's
it.
a couple of storm pipes and there's an overflow weir that tie into it, but there's not an open water access into the lake today. So I think the discussion, seems like the group is okay with dockage into the water. I think we've talked about the, access around the lake, and I think we've established that part of it, allow the public that they could walk around, walk on the paths. I think we're kind of in the,
Well, in fishing, I mean, we would probably do something where you go up to a point where you could fish off the dock or
designated
something.
area for fishing.
Platform, same thing.
I think the
Well,
biggest question is,
if there's a public walkway around it, there's people are gonna walk to the water's edge and fish wherever they aren't told they can't.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. as
No,
long
I
as
don't
it's
either. I'm
there.
just,
so I think the issue we're at is public access to the water for,
and
swimming. Do you want to talk swimming? Do you want to talk?
Well, what Dan said is pretty, I don't think a private developer is gonna own that pond. I don't think they're gonna wanna take on the liability of public getting into their, walking around, falling into their pond. I think if I'm a private developer, I'm saying to the town, take this is yours.
No, we
This is
actually
open
get
space.
access easements around all properties with waterfront on, we've done it on Empire Boulevard, we're doing it everywhere. We don't have really too much of a problem. We do take the liability of the walkways. I mean, if we take an easement over them, we take the liability of the walkway. But we've been doing that for years and years.
I can,
The difference though is we're saying, right, you're inviting the public to come use that pond, unlike other drainage ponds that you guys have easements
Right.
over, right? So now you're asking me, a private landowner, to allow the public to come use this space, but I'm gonna assume all the liability for
Well,
it.
we're gonna talk to
And
you
it-
about that the first day you walk in to see if you wanna buy the property. If you tell me that you don't wanna do that, I'm gonna tell you that might not be the right property for you. And I do that every day. Some people do it and some people don't. We've been very lucky because we do get easements over properties along the waterfront.
Are there any precedents around the area of this scenario? Private waterway?
I don't know.
So used to all the lakes.
I guess that's a question we can ask. We can talk to the consultants and see what experience they've had, or what they've done in other locations. I mean, we got to keep moving along for time. I don't want to get held up on this one issue. We'll come back
Just
to
one
this.
more on this. Jim, the town's not taking ownership, is that a liability issue? I mean, is that the concern? I mean, it's the same
No, we're
liability
not
you take
taking
on
ownership
with
of it
anything.
because the land is gonna be sold with the pond on it. I mean, whoever buys that property is gonna buy the pond, that's why they're going there. They want access to the water and they wanna be able to utilize and have control over it. And certainly the intent is to let them do that, but what I'm saying is there will be a component, because in all of our waterfront districts, we want the public to have access to the waterfront. We will require an access easement around the perimeter of that pond, with possible access for fishing purposes or whatever. Now, the fishing may take place on the east side of the pond, away from the residences, away from the businesses, but the public will have the right of access for fishing or hiking or whatever. It's pretty much passive recreation, it's not gonna be...
No, that's what I was
but the
expecting.
developer could offer the
That's what I-
pond to the town for dedication.
I mean, that's what I was thinking, that's what I would do.
If I were the developer, I'd want to have the ability to make money off of it.
I think in the past, you guys have turned down those generous offers, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dolomite's offered to have us buy the property, we just don't have the money to do it. And certainly, I think that there's value to that pond. And,
Yeah.
and I think that if I were a developer and I wanted to build something on it, I want to have access to it when I wanted it, not if the town's letting me have it. It'll be interesting. I mean, that's going to be the thing that we'll be talking to all the developers about when they finally decide to come in and look at it.
Okay, well, I think that issue, we got a little more discussion on, at least the public access to the water. We can talk to the consultants, see if they've any other experience with that or knowledge, or reach out to other municipalities, what they've done, so we'll explore that one further. Leave that one open.
Mark, just one thing. Is there any building permitted in the pond?
Such as?
Someone from Saudi Arabia comes and wants to put something in the middle of the pond.
That's a pretty deep pond, I don't know.
Floating structure.
Yeah, that's another one, a floating structure as well. I mean, that stuff we haven't talked about. I mean, we talked about docks today. It seems like we're okay with docks, but, I mean, do you want a swimming platform out in there? I mean, I've seen those in other locations where people floats up in the middle, you can swim out to it, jump off of, do
Your wedding
jumps
reception
and
on
flips
this
there.
very large barge.
I mean, those are all things up for this group, is whether you want to prohibit structures within the water.
I get concerned, and actually Rochelle and I work and have been working for years and years on the Rundequoit Bay. The harbor management plan does not allow for structures any longer to be put in the main surface of the bay because of conflicts between users and among users and potential, danger issues, safety issues. So, I mean, it depends on how much the watershed or the pond's going to be utilized for various stakeholders. If you have a lot of them in there, you certainly don't want to put too many obstructions in there that are going to cause conflicts among the users.
I mean, I know there's been some consideration for a tow rope type system for, people to do wakeboarding or something within an area of the pond. So obviously you would have some sort of A-frame structure, so it's not you can have comments if it's not a habitable structure, but they may have some sort of tower system with tow ropes or other things that go around it. I don't know if that's a consideration, something you don't want to see or have concern about.
That's something we really should think about. That's a good point.
I think it depends on the use. I mean, I don't know what the process is for the review, but, if someone's building a hotel in the center versus building a boathouse so they can store canoes inside or their electric pontoon boat, I think there's a big difference. It'd be pretty hard to describe that or for us to imagine all the possibilities. It might be for planning board or when this project goes up or when someone wants to put something there.
Okay. Well, we can come back to that one as well.
Is our list of questions getting longer than our list of answers?
It may be, but we're getting back into it, and these are the detail items we need to get into, and the stuff that this is where the rubber hits the road. But this is the stuff we've kind of talked conceptually about a lot of things, but these are the level of details we need to get into as we look to wrap this thing up, is to talk about these hard issues. So, not to push it off to another day. I think we've gone through a lot of them, but we can pull up different information. But this is the nitty-gritty that these thoughts and ideas we may or may not think of, but have a structure out in the middle of the water or something on pontoons or pylons or something out in the water, we never have thought about. So, but I say we'll continue on. Comment number 61. I think Zone C is intended for vertical mixed use. I think that might have just been a misnomer. We've talked. That's kind of the least dense area, and then we get into comments about Zone D that we come up on further.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think last meeting we talked about it, but kind of an update on the site is we've had a bit of interest lately from a lot of local developers and stuff. Some of the concerns, so that Zone C currently has an old equipment shop on it, which will be demolished by the end of the month. So that'll be a clean slate up there. That Zone C is pretty small. I mean, we just had a equipment shop. We talked about it last time about possibly combining them all because it'll be very difficult to get 2 or 3 uses out of that Zone C. And also Zone B, just talking to the developer the other day, you know, it's a big area when it includes that connection, but from the people that have walked the site, it's, you know, it's going to be a 2-lane road, and then it's not much buildable back there. So again, that Zone B is also, you know, it's a big area, but very little for mixed use, for multi-uses. You know, with that being said, I don't know if you want to, if you combine all those sites into one zone, in Zone A, and then all of those have to have 4 uses. You know, this is up for the group discussion, but, you know, there's not much space in those Zone B and C, even though on paper it looks like it. You know, Zone C is right on that tiny little road there, and whatever it's going to be there, it's going to be in plain view of everything, and to try to fit multiple uses on that little postage stamp might be difficult. So, you know, just some concern there. You know, redefining these zones and making sure that the number of uses is work for it.
So would you recommend that everything becomes a Zone A and then you can incorporate or spread out the 4 uses over the areas?
That would be, you know, talking to some developers, that's what they would identify. That Zone B might be more residential housing because it's limited. You might have a couple bigger houses, single family, multi-family, just a few back there.
Do we talk about the uses per zone, or I thought we were talking uses per parcel? So if you're looking at the parcel as a whole, the zone sets what the density could be. So if you're looking at, you know, more residential in that area, as long as you have the uses within the parcel as a whole, so you have your 4 uses because of the size of the property, but then Zone A doesn't have to have 2 uses within, or excuse me, Zone C, you don't have to have 2 uses within Zone C. It's the parcel as a whole that ties together, as long as you have the number of uses within that property. Zone C just designates the intensity of that use, and the same with Zone B and then Zone D. You know, the uses are allowable by the zone and the intensity of it, not the number of uses over the whole property.
Then you'd have to have a master plan for the entire parcel, or else that somebody would pick the low-hanging fruit and the last guy in gets all the stuff that no one else wanted.
I think this site in particular is, I mean, this is going to be sold as one parcel. You know, it's going to be sold in one straight shot. We will not sell off pieces of it because it encompasses, you know, we don't want to let someone have the prime stuff, and, you know, it's all together. So I think different than Route 250 is this is all going to be one parcel. It's, you know, I see it as being one owner that's going to be developing all of it. You know, that might be later where I don't know if I'd see them
But that
splitting off.
doesn't prohibit something that the one owner that buys it to something.
Yes, yeah, well,
But that's a good point. We would require an overall master plan for the property when we met with the developer.
But then if they sold off the pieces, then now you have a separate parcel, now your uses have to be per whatever parcel. So if Zone
then you're back to,
if Zone C piece is sold off to an individual owner, then now you have to do your mixed use with your 2 uses or whatever within that area.
Well, and
If it's part of the greater whole, then you could have, you know, 2 uses here, 1 use here, and, you know, a 4th use on Zone B.
Even if a
And even
master
if it
plan was
wasn't-
approved for the whole property?
Yeah, I'm thinking if we had a master plan for the entire property and say that was still owned by one entity, and then all of a sudden they sold that portion off, if it still complied with the overall master plan for the site, it would make sense to allow them to develop it as what the master plan called for.
Yeah, because I may only want to build an office building, and somebody else, some other developer may want to build apartments, or
it's
townhouses.
pretty, I
whatever.
mean, that's pretty common for
Yeah.
developers to join for, I mean, so you got a commercial guy and you got a residential guy, I mean, they're.
Right.
Yeah, I think the key is the master plan, and if you can get a plan that you really like that meets the needs of the district, then you go with
There's a
that plan.
So that
potential
goes-
problem, though, that you don't develop, if you have a master plan for the entire site, if you don't develop the mixed uses simultaneously, you could wind up with all the residential, and no one ever implements the rest of the plan.
That's a risk with every development.
Well,
It is.
Lincoln's builds a store.
It could be that for
Doesn't
every
mean it's gonna be
30 units, you have to have
storage.
so much other use built at the same time.
I thought that was kind of what we were talking about the last time with both of these, was that there was some minimum requirements so that you avoided that.
Yeah, I have to build some percentage of each of the uses in each phase, maybe.
Look at a developer out of Syracuse who come in. Excuse me.
Then you also have to address that, what you're saying about a master plan, that if it should be subdivided, that the master plan still
Still
takes
stands on
precedence
its own,
in
right.
being standing.
Right.
You've got to address that.
Jack, have you guys, anybody that you've talked to, have they actually put pencil to paper and tried to lay something out to get a sense on how much? I mean, that's the one thing, I'll be honest with you, on both of these that I'm struggling with is, I mean, this looks great, not 8.5 by 11, but what does this really mean out?
I think,
there?
you know, from what we see is there's too many questions with this committee being in process,
Yeah.
with reclamation still going on down there. You know, I think that just the timing of everything, it's tough to put, you know, get numbers.
Yeah.
We haven't really seen any numbers. We've had a lot of interest, but they're kind of waiting to see what happens here. And they're chomping at the bit to get going and see where this is going. And I think, you know, Route 250 has the same, a lot of developers kind of waiting to see where we go here.
Are you seeing interest from outside the area?
Some interest. A lot of the local developers, though, that, you know, we deal with on a, you know, daily basis, definitely express interest.
Jack, has anything ever been built in Zone B? I know you've built in Zone A, Zone C.
Have we ever built anything?
Has
No.
anything ever been built
No. No, it's always been yeah, mineable area. It's kind of just fill right now. So it's actually a little low for the floodplain. There's not much use back there. You know, it's one way in, one way out. So yeah, I mean, just no.
So your recommendation is you take the zone A, B, and C and kind of contiguously lump them all together and doing what with it? Making a minimum of 4 uses? You provide them all that zone A designation?
I mean, my real concern, yeah, I think the 4 uses for Zone A is, you know, definitely reasonable. I think it's 3 for Zone B. I don't have it in front of me. Yeah, that's my concern. So either lowering that, because really the buildable area is not that long piece, those acres there. It's more like 4 acres, so it might be more like a Zone C where it might have a 1 or 2.
Okay.
You know, I guess that's for the committee, not for me to say. I would say you combine them all, or at least A and B, and have 4 uses.
My only concern with Zone C would be the height. It's a bit higher than everything else, that's all.
Yeah.
Then I think part of the discussion with this group about Zone B, though, is, you know, proximity to Ellison Park, where I think, you know, Zone A, you're talking about height in Zone A, you know, up to 6 stories. Now, as you get to Zone B, I think the group kind of looked at it more as a transitional towards, you know, lower density or intensity residential or something that could be.
Well, and it does say, it says a
Done that
minimum
area.
of 3 different uses, but it does say all 3 can be residential, is what. It's a little, it says minimum of 3 different uses, but all 3 can be residential.
On page 91, the chart there.
Or C up there, yeah. I think just that the map and the area is misleading. You know, I think that Zone B also wraps around a little further up north. You know, I don't know who put this map together, if it was just, I think it was just kind of put there, you know, and not looked at buildable area. So I think some of those pieces can expand, some can contract.
Yeah, I think this was just put together as just a talking point to kind of get started and, you know, generate conversation. We can talk about, you know, number of uses in each zone, obviously where Zone B begins and ends, and, you know, as well as Zone A.
A lot of A lot of Zone D is not developable by any means anyways, is it? I mean, you got grade change and you also.
No, you wouldn't be able.
And that is also the area that we took the development rights. You had the general farm market there and all that area.
This area over
Yeah,
here.
so that's really not gonna change.
Yeah.
But I think Zone D, and there was some question, and I say we're quickly coming to a close on our time, but in Zone D, there was talk about, it says no buildings allowed other than small support structures. So I guess the definition of, what's a support structure, I think there was a comment question about, and I didn't get there quite yet. They talked about, wording change to say, it currently says no buildings. The suggestion was saying benches, signage, covered shelters, and other amenities for trail or visitor experience. So we may need to better define what auxiliary support structures are, as whether we're talking about, we say no buildings, but, what else would that be? Trail signage, benches, stuff like that. In Zone D, you can do something, but, no physical construction of buildings, residences, boathouses, I don't know. What's the committee's thoughts on that?
I think the intent was to keep it less developed, so, it seems like, certainly nothing with
If you wanna
electricity
do
or
like a
running
little
water.
kiosk or something like that.
Yeah.
Gazebo.
Yeah, decorative type things or.
So that was, I'm sorry, jumping ahead to comment 151. Can I get everybody on the same page? Was that the suggestion or redefinition of what auxiliary support structures is? It was benches, signage, covered shelters, other amenities. It could be a, gazebo or an overview or, if there's a viewing area or something, but nothing of
Yeah,
a
I would
commercial, residential type scope. I don't mean to jump ahead, but,
Covers everything.
okay. I mean to jump ahead, but that kind of made sense if the group's,
What was the thought in D as far as like zip line or anything else where you had to have a start and ending point? I'm just throwing that up there.
yeah, I mean, I know we talked about, different things of areas to go to. Is that considered accessory? Is that considered, that comes back to the discussion we had earlier about, structures in the water as well. If you had a, a tow rope area that, obviously you'd have to have some pole framework or something that would allow that you could have a cabling that could go around. Potentially if that's in this end of the lake or whatever, just thinking deeper water, that may, have some support structure that would be on shore, adjacent to the water in those areas.
To me, those types of uses makes sense, and it's the type of thing that I kind of thought we were encouraging earlier on in those discussions.
Yeah.
You go to, not that our weather is comparable, but you go to parts of Jamaica or something, and you get out on the island, and there's jungle gyms out in the water. Can you do something like that in a shallower area if that was something you paid to do? Those seem like the types of uses that we were trying to encourage versus something much more intense.
Yeah, just trying to make sure we have consensus as we're moving ahead on this, that everybody's kind of in agreement that that's kind of what we're looking for. Again, we're trying not to be prohibitive of too many things and define it, but also make sure that, we're covering our bases on what we don't want to see. So it sounds like that verbiage kind of makes sense to everybody. Okay. Let's see, we got about 15 minutes left. See which items we've kind of talked about a lot of them as we've gone through. We talked about accessory vehicles. I kind of mentioned that earlier, number 152, about golf carts in and out of the site. I don't know if on the property, if that's something we want to get into in ordinance, or, put that as something that would be a code item, either prohibiting in that or promoting that. And I think, I've never been to the villages, but I'm kind of guessing that's what the person's talking about, just from what I've seen on TV of people, going between their residential units to a restaurant or something back and forth, or zipping around. Is that something we want to promote, discourage, or let a future board make a determination?
As long as it's not on a public road. Otherwise, it's got to be a licensed vehicle. Got to meet all the code for that.
Does the, I know we had looked at 8-foot sidewalk
requirement? Would those vehicles be allowed on sidewalks, or would that be on a separate system?
Technically, nothing's supposed to be on the sidewalk for pedestrians.
But pedestrians,
Bicycles
right?
aren't supposed to be on sidewalks.
Yeah. So it doesn't complicate the idea of the sidewalks, is what
I mean, it would be nice to be able to get these people to Panorama. I mean, it'd be a real plus to be able to do that. I'm not, I mean, we've been looking at Penfield Road for years trying to get access down it. It's got some real topographic constraints. It's gonna cost a lot of money to get down that road.
Well, let's continue going through these Manitou Lake specific questions. We can go back if we have time to the generic comments in the previous ones. So 153, I think we've talked about the possibilities. They talked about a canoe or kayak launch. I think we need to come back on the public access to that, but I think we talked about electric use. He says non-motorized, but I think electric use, everybody seemed okay with electric boat of some sort for that. Comment 161, the area currently lacks service and capacity to expand is not demonstrated. There are some utilities in the area, but I think that's a developer type issue, is getting utilities down to the site, getting sewers there, waters there. You know, again, we're looking at an ordinance, same with 250. You know, we do have some capacity issues with sewers on 250 and other areas. Not saying we'll have issues forever, but, you know, we're developing an ordinance, but, you know, it comes to site plan issues, you need to make sure you have your utilities and stuff available at the time to do it. If they can get them there, they can get them there. If they can't, then they can't. So it's not an ordinance
You're
issue.
going to have that challenge with any use, like, I mean, even a single-family home at this point.
I mean, that's not an ordinance
You're gonna have
type
to
issue. That's a
demonstrate
site plan level issue. Okay. Comment number 164 talks about additional trips in the area impacting the 400 households in the Panorama Plaza to 490 area. Obviously, that would necessitate a traffic impact study. Once you knew what was there, what was being proposed, you would look at, you know, traffic impact study for Old Penfield Road, the Panorama Trail area, you know, where that went and how that, you know, the access is and what that impact. So again, that's not, you know, so much an ordinance issue as a site plan, SECRA, you know, if you got into an FEIS or, you know, environmental impact statement with that.
I would think anything here is going through that process, right? In expanded form.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, we're trying to generalize an ordinance of what could be built, and then obviously, once anybody proposes anything, we'd have to get into, you know, site plan issues and architecture and lighting and all that stuff, and part of that would probably be an environmental impact statement to, you know, how does that impact the waters, and we'd have to look at stormwater, you know, for, you know, how do you treat stormwater when you have high groundwater levels? You know, you'd have to look at alternative options of, you know, rain guards, biofilters. You're not going to do a deep pool if you're getting into an aquifer or down into the water level, but those are environmental issues you'd have to look at as part of the site plan approval.
Mark, when you do the rezone, you have to do seeker. And your seeker on the rezone, you're thinking would be, you're not talking about a generic impact statement, you're, you know, it's a law? Is that, I mean, how are you going to handle that, do you know?
Seeker has to be addressed no matter what action is taken.
Right.
The idea of rezoning would require seeker to be addressed. We could look at this as in two ways. We could do a generic, which talks about change from R120 to mixed use, whatever that ends up being.
Right.
That would address the fact that there will be increased traffic issues, there will be increased drainage issues. In which case, we could also recommend that they have to be mitigated as part of the development process. And you could do that through site-specific impact statements as development occurs.
Yeah, you know, I think if you did a generic early on, it would provide, I think it's going to cost the town money. I mean, they're not cheap to do, but it would provide the developer some assurances where Jack's at of that things can get done.
Well, again, generic talks about what ifs, you know,
Right.
you're really not zeroing in on anything other than the fact that you're recognizing you're going to increase traffic, you're going to increase stormwater issues, and a cadre of other things you're going to deal with. But you go through that process because you've got to find out that there is going to be some type of potential impact associated with the change. Once that's done, when the development comes in for it, Then they've got to do a site-specific, defining exactly what it is they're going to do on the site and how it impacts or doesn't impact.
The only thing I would suggest is when you do, whether you do a generic and you're gonna just do a cursory review, when the developer comes in to do an overall look at it, like you said, you want a master plan, I think the seeker ought to consider that master plan. Because I think you're talking segmentation, but I think you're also gonna put the last guy in, if there's a last guy in a bad spot.
And you could even, you could do the traffic studies and the drainage analysis and identify limits, maybe you can build 500 units, maybe you can build 5 units. If you stay within those parameters, then you're okay with seeker. If you exceed those parameters, because now you're not mitigating what was addressed.
Right.
Now you've got to come back and do a site specific.
Right, and I think that would be helpful to the developer, honestly.
And that
Just
could
a
be
thought.
possible. But that goes all back to, if we do a generic, those costs go back to the developer eventually anyways. We do that with all of our projects.
Okay.
But you have to make a vast number of assumptions.
We have to do some major studies, yeah.
Okay. We do have a few minutes left if we want to try to wrap up most of these here. Going back to the non-committee member comments on the general document. So I just get back, number 77, the comment just said that the town board should include, as an advisory as well as PRC, Conservation Board, and Planning Board. So I think that's a pretty standard part of our process to have all those boards weigh in on whatever development that's there. Comment number 81, we talked briefly about the 14-foot building heights earlier. I think that was a recommendation of the consultant, but I think in some instances, I don't know if we want to require that. I think that, in a storefront in more of an urban area or something like that, I think the 14-foot height gives you turnover as things change. Pretty much any use could go into there, but, I think in certain areas, so maybe that, again, that could be a recommendation, to consider that, but I don't know as we want to make that a hard, fast ordinance requirement that it has to be 14-foot.
We don't require building heights in any other zoning, right?
It's not a building height. I think it was the first floor.
It's the first floor.
I think it was to try to get at that scalability issue.
Yeah.
It really limits, limits the market though as to who's going in there.
Yeah, all the suggestions about just having the language be having the appearance, because what they're trying to control is the visual scale. So if it's fake, it's fake. You've got the outcome that you're looking for. There are a couple of those comments in here.
Okay. And then number 96 kind of weighs into, what we talked about before about public access to areas, but it talks about the definition between open space and public space. And I think that's something we need to talk about more, because we talked about you need to have 20% open space as part of your project. But is all of that public space, or is that, if you're a resident there and you have an open space between, in a courtyard in the middle of an area, it's an open space, but it may not be accessible to the public. So I think we need to talk to the consultant and get it, wordsmith down a little bit more on that and get a little bit more of a definition on how and, those two play back and forth. Because this, you'll have public access around the lake, you'll have public areas, but I think there's going to be more, I think open space in this one is kind of a given. If you have the lake itself, you have more than 20% of your site is going to be open space, even if everything else was developed. But I think more on 250, we need to, get into the discussion about, the difference between open space is, just a green area, or, could be courtyards, could be, a patio area, versus what's a public space, the public's allowed to come into.
Kingdom County EPOD areas is open space.
And that's a discussion
For establishing density.
as well.
It's not developed. On this site, the open space, the EPOD area, Zone D, a lot. If you
It's more than 50% of the site. So.
right, you could have Zone 8 covered in 6-story buildings.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think we need a little bit more definition from the consultant on that and a little bit more feedback. We'll circle back on that one. Number 107 talks about design character and talked about not having two buildings the same next to each other, same color, texture, architectural details. I understand the intent, but I also can understand the difficulty as a developer trying to make every building totally different or totally separate. So I don't know what the committee's thoughts are on that basically you're requiring that each structure next to each other has, different architectural elements, different textures, different colors. Is that too much? But I think,
more or less, it has to be varied within the development,
yes.
rather than saying one is going to be exactly different than one next to them.
And that's what I think. I understand the intent, and maybe we just need to wordsmith that a bit, that, we don't end up with, I live in gray building number 7, it's the exact same building, you can't tell apart one building from another.
Say what we don't want.
And I think that's just the part that kind of came up as,
A homogeneous thing, we do want a very,
character and design and architectural elements, and having the same building after building after building of apartments is totally not the intent. So I think we just need to come at that a different way. Okay. That leaves us 2 more. I think the one we talked about already is the 15,000 square foot per level, and then also comment number 117. And then the required 14-foot height, we've talked about those. And then 123, I think, also refers back to the 15,000 square feet, saying that design standard is a little bit too restrictive. Just, they understand that the town doesn't want big box, but we just may need to define what big box is a little bit more, just to make sure that we don't get big box if we take off the limits on the 15,000 square foot.
Is the 15 only for commercial we're talking?
Yes. Well, I know Dave's going to go big.
But
So.
I mean, as far as,
you can go 20, you can go whatever.
build apartments, I mean.
Yeah. No, I was just talking on commercial, trying to get, I think that was the intent, was to focus on smaller retailers or smaller office spaces, but, I think 15 may be a little restrictive on some things if you had if it became a hotel or there was something, I don't know, that
If it was a huge operation.
something, or a big restaurant or a party house or something, 15 may be a bit restrictive, but how do you lift those limits off there? I think we just need to define what a big box is a little bit more, so, Lowe's or Home Depot, not that Manitou Lake, would be desirable by any stretch for somebody like that, but I'm thinking, as we expand this to 250, LaSalle's Landing or, other areas, those are much more susceptible to a big box development on LaSalle's Landing. If you could put a Home Depot along Empire Boulevard, that's not what we want to see, but we don't want to take those restrictions off and allow that to happen. So I think we need to define that big box a little bit more. Okay, that's all the comments we went through. We talked about permitted uses during the discussion. We do have some items we need to circle back on, get more information on. Overall, obviously we're moving ahead. We need to talk more about process. We need to talk about uses, but I think we kind of talked about a lot of detail tonight, got into a lot of things. We'll push this stuff back to the consultants. One, ask them for information, but two, kind of push this information back to them. Obviously, we have the discussion, with the 250 group as well, and have them refine it, and get them to, maybe kind of move towards the next step to, keep this process moving. Once we get this information back to the consultant, we'd like to turn around something fairly quickly to, get back to this group and, kind of keep the momentum going from what we have today and, kind of where we've gone. Seems like, we've had a lot of consensus here tonight, a lot of, good discussion. If you have other things you think of after this, please send me an email, send me information, Zach, Phyllis, Jim, myself. Anybody have any other parting words or discussion? But I just say I appreciate everybody coming tonight and everybody, sharing the information, everybody looking at the documents. I know we've given you a lot of information to look at, a lot of responses to, to consider. We do have a lot of work to go ahead. We have a lot of, more stuff to do, but appreciate everybody's input.
I thought this feedback format was handy. I liked it. It was less overwhelming to just get those bites.
Yeah, I say we did have, over 190 comments. We do have them all. The committee did get all of those. By no means, if your comment was not in this, was it not considered important? These were kind of more the ones we thought either didn't have consensus on it or had debate on it. We had a lot of great comments that everybody on the committee wrote back and said, yeah, I agree, it's great, let's keep going on it, or we need more information. So those ones we just kind of, tried to take those ones out, and then obviously we attached in the main thing, a lot of grammatical stuff and comments, and we will address those as well. So, okay, thank you everybody. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it, and I say we will